Welcome to the Masters of Public Administration, Public Policy Analysis. Our group, Anna, Danielle, myself, Michael, and Brandon, worked on the Senate Bill 1391. The Senate Bill 1391 became effective this year as of January 1st. It was approved by Governor Jerry Brown, and it was something that was in progress prior to January 1st. It allows the district attorney to sentence juveniles to juvenile hall with the idea of rehabilitation rather than sending them straight to prison. Most of our findings came from the legislator.california.gov website. We were able to use that reference for a lot of the findings and the facts to research other parts of the paper. We are able to visualize the steps that a bill must go through in order to be passed to the next step, to become a law. Some other important findings were from the California Corrections and Rehabilitation Department website. This new policy eliminates the ability to try a defendant under the age of 16 as an adult, and instead sending him or her to seek help. And the help can be anything from health and mental counseling, mentoring programs, educational programs, and just programs for them to be on the path to becoming successful within society, rather than throwing them out and having these individuals find resources on their own.
As juvenile delinquency and the juvenile justice system continues to be a topic of debate throughout society, juvenile delinquency in recent times has challenged society to think about the nature of both adolescent development and the importance of implementing effective policies for the punishment as well as the rehabilitation of the offending youth. Studies have actually shown that under controlled and structured situations, adolescents have the ability to perform just as well as adults on a variety of tasks involving critical thinking and cognitive functioning. These results include comparable scores and results on cognitive tests, measuring logical and rational reasoning. And juveniles, especially of 16 years or older, have been found to make sound decisions. So, when those results are displayed, researchers begin to question other underlying causes of the poor decision making that these juveniles are making. The concept of psychological maturity has been found to be an important concept when understanding juvenile delinquency. It's been defined by researchers and psychologists as the level of responsibility, attitude and temper, outlook on social context, and being more susceptible to peer pressure, as well as the lack of prioritizing responsibilities. And it's also been linked to juveniles being more motivated by rewards rather than by punishment, which is why they're more likely to commit crimes when they're just focused on the benefit of the crimes. Psychological maturity has also been linked to the idea that juveniles are more likely to engage in careless activities in the presence of their peers due to the peer pressure. And many of the youth involved in criminal behavior come from backgrounds involving poverty and maltreatment, such as physical and sexual abuse, which leads to undiagnosed psychological disorders and emotional instability. All those factors I just mentioned, as well as the factors on the chart listed here to the right, have been considered by officials and policy analysts who wish to change the growing percentage of juveniles involved in criminal activity. In response to that problem statement and those factors mentioned before, The authors of Senate Bill 1391 have taken away the ability to try a defendant under the age of 16 in adult court. It's been eliminated because they feel that by retaining the younger youth in the juvenile system, where education and rehabilitative services are mandated, the youth have a better chance to grow, rebuild, and return to the community with greater potential to be productive citizens. Ultimately, the intentions of Senate Bill 1391 are to improve society through reforms and resources in the justice system.
So Senate Bill 1391 has numerous stakeholders. For the purpose of this report, I broke it down into primary stakeholders and associated stakeholders, or non-key stakeholders. A primary stakeholder is anyone who stands to be directly affected by the passage of Senate Bill 1391. These persons that are directly affected were identified as juvenile offenders who are within 14 to 15 years of age at the time of their suspected criminal offense. The secondary or associated stakeholders is basically anyone else. Victims of crimes from those committed by perpetrators who are 14 to 15 years of age, the general public from a welfare stance on the rehabilitative efforts associated with Senate Bill 1391, and additionally the juvenile court and criminal court as where their burdens or reduction in case flow. For the criminal court, because the matters will be handled by the juvenile court as opposed to handled in the criminal court, and creating an additional burden on the criminal court and justice system.
The policy model we chose for this Senate bill, or this policy, is the rational model of a decision system. In rationalism, it involves the calculation of all social, political, and economic values sacrificed or achieved by public policy, and the outputs of the policy are not necessarily those that can be measured in dollars. So for this policy, it would more so measure what are the benefits and costs of the 14 and 50-year-olds staying in the juvenile system, as opposed to the benefits and costs of sentencing those juveniles in prison. So as demonstrated in this chart on the right, the policymakers should take calculations and make comparisons of each alternative, and then decide which alternative would pretty much have the most benefits to society at a lower cost.
In evaluating the outcomes of Senate Bill 1391, I think it's important to note that Senate Bill 1391 was passed in 2018, but did not become effective until January 2019. And given the early stages since the implementation of Senate Bill 1391, I think it would be ineffective to attempt to establish what the outcomes are of Senate Bill 1391 at this early stage in the passage. But what I do think is important to note is what wasn't working prior to the passage of Senate Bill 1391. Well, we know that juvenile offenders who are prosecuted as adults receive less rehabilitation efforts than their juvenile counterparts who operate within the parameters of the juvenile justice system. With that becomes a lack of educational services that are not provided in the adult correctional system. And this data can be supported by the CDC, who in 2010 published a study that indicated that juveniles who were retained by the juvenile courts were less likely to recidivate and were shown to build stronger family connections, creating later economic opportunities in their life. That prepares them to join society, as opposed to incarcerating them and not rehabilitating them. When their sentence is up, they're going to join society with the same mentality in which they entered into the juvenile correctional facility. And now, in examining where we were prior to Senate Bill 1391, I believe that if we look at the potential for the outcomes, since it's very early in the stages of Senate Bill 1391, that with keeping juveniles under the juvenile umbrella, we're going to see a lot less juvenile recidivism, where they're not going to be repeat offenders because they're actually going to be rehabilitated and offered services that's going to help them in building those stronger family connections, giving them that education so they can enhance their economic opportunities, and thus in turn they will be removing themselves from the correctional facilities and burdening the courts and the justice system, which will in turn reduce the fiscal burden on the criminal justice system collectively.
Now we'll move on to our group's recommendations and what we've found and suggest as a result of analyzing the effects and rationale behind this bill. So the first recommendation has to do with rehabilitation reform. Because of SB 1391, we're not going to be seeing young offenders, 14, 15-year-olds, going to the adult prison system. And instead, they're going to be going to the juvenile detention system, which consists of rehabilitation programs. So now it's crucial that our rehabilitation programs are as effective as possible. We want to reduce recidivism immediately. And in order to do this, in California, we suggest that the state cooperates with the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, as well as other states who have their own rehabilitation programs. Looking at the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, they have a list of nationwide programs, and they're ranked and evaluated based on the efficacy of the program, the promise of it, the likelihood of reduced recidivism, and it also gives excellent analysis on the cost involved in each of these programs. So I believe our group believes that's vital for a state to partake in rehabilitation reform to ensure that our juveniles are indeed going to be law-abiding citizens in the future. And in order to increase the success of reform, requires improvement in cultural sensitivity, inclusive measures, and rehabilitation pedagogy. That means instead of using a one-size-fits-all approach or intimidating juveniles, such as the failed Scared Straight program, where juvenile offenders were given tours of adult prisons, intimidated by the prisoners, it was found that that Scared Straight program led to higher recidivism rates rather than decreased recidivism rates. So we want to improve the cultural sensitivity and really curate these programs per the individual rather than trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach. The next recommendation is to rethink supervision. And what that means is to rethink the current process of sentencing juvenile offenders to probation, and then if they violate probation, then to send them off to juvenile detention. And the reason is because if there's a correlation found between straight sentences and reduced recidivism. The study found that if you just sentence offenders to prison, if they're an adult or juvenile detention, at the onset and skip the probation process, it led to better outcomes for the offender and reduced recidivism. And our final and most ambitious recommendation is to emphasize prevention. And this involves improving programs for at-risk youth. This goes back to our discussion of rehabilitation reform for teenagers after they've committed the crime, but in this case is to work with them and to target troubled youth and teenagers and really foster positive outcomes and help them become law-abiding citizens and make positive contributions to society rather than to fall into a life of crime before it even happens. And then next, we would like to recommend culturally sensitive policing and community building. Studies have shown that crime rises based on poor economic conditions, poor environments, is to improve all facets of these troubled teenagers' environment and economic conditions to mitigate their risk of falling into a life of crime. And then next, going back to our discussion of rational policy making, is to utilize big data. for continued decision making is collecting information on recidivism rates and economics of crime and the like, and really seeing what works and what's not working and to explore alternatives going forward and not just to rest on our laurels and figure our work is done. Okay, so that wraps up our presentation. Thank you for listening and thank you for reviewing our work. And these are all of our references for your pleasure and review. References continued, and that will do it. Thank you very much.